Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 474th episode of Constructed Criticism. I am your host, Mason, joined by nobody this week. That's right, Spencer and Abe are unfortunately out sick. Abe has COVID. We wish you a speedy recovery, bud. And if you're a parent, you know how this one's going to be. Spencer's kids got sick. He got sick. So that means no Spencer this week on the show either. He's lost his voice. We hope both of you are back and healthy very soon so we can do another fun episode next week. But for now, it's just going to be me talking, doing the thing, and I guess we can instead have a guest on. This past weekend, I went up to Caldwell, Ohio, and played in the Apex Gaming events. It was a very fun time, and afterwards, Ross, Merriam, and I were just sort of talking and hanging out, and during the conversation, I was like, dang, this should probably just be someone we have guests on the podcast. Ross is really smart and, sort of has a very unique way about approaching things and sort of talking about stuff, and I think listeners should get a lot out of it. And then this morning, when everyone was like, hey, I don't think we can do the show, I was like, wait, let's see if we can get Ross. So, I always say it, heroes don't always wear capes, so Ross was able to save the day and come on the show. So hopefully y'all are going to enjoy that. We just got back and recorded it, and I think it was really great. I can't wait for y'all to hear in just a minute. But before we do that, I do want to quickly say thank you to everyone who supported the show via sharing or on patreon.com/ccmtg. The show is always free. We can give back. The Patreon Discord is really happening. There's a lot of stuff going on there, and if you're a like-minded person, sort of with the always improving mindset, that might be a great place for you to go and to meet other people if maybe you don't have a really big local community. So it's a great way to support the show and also meet other players and grow. So with that out of the way, you can always find us on social media at ccmtg. That's going to link to everyone else on the show's information. It's just me, so I don't want to list everyone's Twitter handle. And honestly, let's get to the star of the show, Ross Merriam. And now we have our special guest on this week's episode, Ross Merriam. Ross, if someone is going to be introducing you, how might best they start introducing you? Because I think of you as a man who drinks and knows things. But what might be the best way for people in Magic to know you?
Well, certainly through my work on the SCG Tour and for Star City Games on the content side, that's always going to be where people know me most closely from Magic. So, longtime SCG Tour grinder and co-host of Versus Live and longtime columnist for Star City Games. I think that trifecta just about covers it.
Yeah, and you competed sort of, for the people who weren't around when SCG was, because it's crazy to think that's a whole different era now. But, you competed in a lot of the Players' Championships. You grinded the tour. You did very well for yourself. You've also played, lots of people I think know you from SCG, but we were talking a little bit about last night at the Apex event where, you've played lots of Pro Tours and, you've done more than just SCGs. And so you're really someone who's been playing for a long time. And when did you start playing and how did your sort of journey with improving get started?
Nailing down a particular time when I started playing is a kind of interesting question in my taste, because my first exposure to Magic came through my older brother, who played played casually when he was in middle school. And so this would have been like the mid 90s. And I would just play with him around the house. But I never really got into it myself. And he quit after a couple of years. And I picked up the game again by myself when I was in 8th grade. So this would have been the 2001, 2002 school years, fall of 01. Odyssey was the most recent set. And I was going to a new middle school that had just opened in my part of Connecticut. That was supposed to be super math, science, and technology focused. Every single classroom had 4 or 5, I think it was Pentium 3 computers. For people that remember that era of computing technology. And obviously going to a new school that was in a different city, I met a lot of new people, and the friend group that I made were all into Magic. So I started playing by myself then. So usually when I'm asked this question, I give that time frame, 2001. But technically I've been exposed to the game since I was very young. I started playing F&Ms and at my local store towards the end of that school year, so like spring of 02. And then I got my DCI card to start playing sanctioned events at regionals in May of 2003. So competitively, I would say I've been playing for about 20 years.
Awesome. And when did you sort of make the step towards wanting to you mentioned you're playing locally with your friends, and you're doing F&M type stuff, but what was sort of the thing that motivated you and made you want to start taking that step towards things like, 2Ks and SCGs at the time soon thereafter, and then GPs. What was sort of the spark that made you want to go down that route?
Well, my friends and I had several different friend groups with Magic while I was younger. We would go to occasional PTQs and local Grand Prix and things like that. And so I racked up a few, PTQ top eights over the years, but I never was going to them consistently, to the point where I would classify myself as a quote unquote grinder through the 2000s. And then when I was in college in the late 2000s, I sort of took a step back from playing and focused more on my studies. And I had planned to go to graduate school. I was going to get, a PhD in some mathematical field because that's what my undergraduate degree is in. But I sort of realized over the summer after I graduated that I wasn't really passionate enough to want to do that. So I dropped out quite early, and then I had that stereotypical post grad malaise where I really wasn't doing anything, and Magic was a natural fill to that space. I didn't really intend to turn it into what it has become, but with the SEG tour emerged around that time in the early 2010s, and I ended up just sort of going to enough tournaments and doing well at enough tournaments, and it grew from there. So there wasn't really anything intentional on my part up until the mid 2010s when I had already established myself as a top player on the SEG tour. It was just a desire not to work a real job.
I respect and love the honesty. So, you just mentioned there. So around the mid 2010s, Ross is sort of an established and top SCG player, and you can watch lots of feature matches of Ross after this one. After you're done here, if you want to watch one. But what was sort of the beginning of the stepping stones, and what were when you look back, what was like a huge sort of level up moment and a step for you when it came to being from like Ross, the person who goes to the events, to someone who's like, I've got to play against Ross Merriam this round?
The first big level up of moment for me was my first STG Tour win. Back then, it was called the Open Series, and it's a little stereotypical to point to a tournament that you won, but in this case, there's a specific circumstance around it. So this was an invitational weekend. It was in Indianapolis. This is actually the first. This was the first Magic tournament that I paid for a flight to go to. I had played one foreign pro tour at this point, the Cobbly Pro Tour in Paris. So Watsy paid for my flight for that one. This is the first time where I said, you know what, I'm going to shell out the couple $100. I'm going to fly to Indianapolis to play this invitational, and this was June of 2012, and I was playing Blue White Delver in Standard, one of the legendary decks of Standards past. Guides to St. Draft, Delver of Secrets, a lot of Phyrexian Mana spells, a bunch of broken cantrips, Mana Leak, and so forth. And I had played that deck for months. I was very comfortable with it. And my Legacy deck was sort of irrelevant. But I show up to the Invitational feeling good. I had played Blue White Delver at the previous Invitational and got 701 in the Standard portion of it. And this was around the time where, I don't know if you remember this, this might have been before your time, but there was a brief period where the sideboard strategy of all the Blue White Delver decks was to morph into a sort of control deck. So they usually had some sort of 6-drop creature as a 2 of, usually Consecrated Sphinx, but sometimes it was like Stun Titan or Frost Titan, weird creatures like that, and some Wrath of Gods or Day of Judgments, whichever Wrath effect was in the format. And you would take out your Delver of Secrets and morph into this kind of control deck that had a really low land count, and you made up for it with all the cantrips. And I wasn't super comfortable playing that kind of strategy at the time, but in my head, that's what all the best players were doing. That was the thing to do. And so I did it. And I went 0-4 drop in the Standard portion of the Invitational. So I didn't even play Legacy during the Invitational. Oof. And I was feeling pretty distraught. And one of the people I was staying with, a Massachusetts grinder, Adam Snook, and had also done poorly in the Invitational, so he was dropped. And I made him go back to our hotel room and just play Delver Mirrors against me for like 4 hours all afternoon while everybody else was finishing day one of the tournament because the next day was a standard open. That's how the invitational weekends worked. And I decided, you know what? I don't like this control plan. I'm not comfortable with it. I am going to make a much more aggressive plan, which I dubbed the Jam plan, because I like playing more aggressively. So I completely rebuilt the sideboard, retuned the main deck to align with the sideboard, and played the what ended up being a 10 round standard open the next day. Won the open. It was my first trophy on the tour, and so it was a very affirming event because I deviated from the norm in a way that I thought was going to be more catered to my skill set, and it worked out quite well. So I think there's something to be said for understanding yourself and your strengths and weaknesses and playing to those strengths and weaknesses as best you can. Obviously, you'd like to not have any weaknesses. And I think there's been some advice over the years where that I think is bad advice. Mainly about expanding your range. That the best player should be able to play any kind of deck at an incredibly high level, and it's just unrealistic. We can't all be that good. So you got to understand where your strengths and weaknesses are and play to those. And I did that then, and that's a lesson that I've carried forward in the years since.
I really like that. It really sparks two questions for me. So the first one I want to kind of ask is, if and I'll think about how I would answer this as well, but like, if someone's listening, like, okay, I love what Ross just said, that makes sense. How do I start to identify my strengths and weaknesses if maybe I'm someone who's like a newer competitive player where I'm really trying to take that level up moment? It's like, okay, I've been the FNM in boss, I've been the local guy, and I'm trying to like take that step and become the player in the area. Like, how do you start identifying those things? Because I would say personally, winning and losing isn't exactly the best indicator to know what you're good at, right?
I would agree. And I think a lot of this comes down to talking with other people and getting other opinions and learning other opinions. So you're not going to be able to understand, the all of the options available before you if you have some sort of blind spot where you always make a certain play in a certain situation. Like bolting a turn one bird, which I think is generally good to do, and but sometimes not. So you're not if you stick to those kinds of rigid heuristics, you're never going to learn the nuances and when to deviate from them. So I think the best way to keep your mind open to seeing the different possibilities before you is to consult with other people because they're going to come at it from a different perspective and likely see things that you don't see. So there's a lot of things about practice and tournament preparation that I think is rather shallow in Magic. Players really just value how many games they're able to jam before a tournament, and they just want to play as many as possible, as quickly as possible. I would rather play fewer games, but get a lot of information and a lot of valuable, learning out of each one of them, and that comes from deep, thoughtful analysis, both by yourself and with other people. And as far as using that to then examine, your strengths and weaknesses, the biggest thing is being honest with yourself. I think for the most part, people understand what they're good and bad at. So there's no real mystery in determining it. It's just having the humility to be honest with yourself about it and say, you know what, I'm not so good at this aspect. I need help sideboarding against aggressive decks, or I need help, playing to my outs when I'm behind so I can, steal a few more wins here or there over the course of a long tournament. And there's a lot of ego around in the Magic community, and with ego comes an unwillingness to admit when you have a weakness or when you're wrong. So you really have to check your ego at the door if you want to improve at the highest level.
Yeah, I love a lot what you said there, and it really made me want to sort of bring in the next part. So it's so beautiful how you transitioned it. But you mentioned about testing, and you sort of mentioned something that we on the show, and especially me, really harp on a lot. That Magic players don't actually test very effectively, right? They really value winning and losing, and they just kind of play a lot of games. and they don't really do more. So I'm really interested because this is actually something I don't think you and I have really spoken about before. So I would love to hear sort of the way you like to approach it. I know you just mentioned you have some thoughtful conversation and reflection, but maybe if there's more to it than that, feel free to expand as much or as little as you like. But I'm really curious about that because that's something we really harp on, that like it should be a process. And you should go in with questions, reflect on the games, and think about, is this the way things actually play out at the bare minimum, when it comes to practice, let alone all the other things you should be doing.
Yeah. So as far as how I like to prepare for things and the way I think it's best to, I would refer people to the brief winners interview I did with Dawn Delozier on Saturday after she won the 5K modern event at Apex, and I talked to her about whether Rakdos, was playing Rakdos Folk, and I talked to her about and asked her whether Rakdos was a deck that she'd been playing for a while or something she picked up more recently, due to its recent success. And she said that on Tuesday she had planned to play a different deck, and Andrew Ellenbogen actually sourced a copy of Rakdos and convinced her to play the deck. And so she had 3 or 4 days to prepare, and did a lot of watching of gameplay videos that are put out by other people. And that's where I always start as step one, is doing my homework and doing some research. You know, and I don't understand why other people are so averse to it, because if you're starting with a brand new deck that you've never played before, there are going to be a lot of things that you're going to spend time figuring out that other people have already figured out. And that, so if you just watch, players that you trust and that have experience with these decks, whoever they may be, and get content through their Patreons or YouTube and various other sources, you can achieve a certain low baseline pretty quickly and much faster than you would by just playing games on your own. And then from that baseline, after I've done the research, I start to think about where I can, improve the deck, or what weaknesses that I think the deck has that I can improve. And when I start playing games, I play them with the idea of looking out for certain things. What are the things that worry me? Is the mana base a little sketchy? Am I short cheap removal spells for Ragavan in a modern deck? Or am I, short interaction for Lotus Field combo in a Pioneer deck? So before I even start testing, in my head, I have this idea of the questions that I still have that are unanswered about the deck. And so I'm testing with answering those questions in mind. Even if it's just jamming leagues, and then towards the end, as I get closer to a tournament, I like to have more focused testing with, someone I know on the other end, where I can say, here's the matchup that I need a few more games in, or here's the sideboard card I want, or sideboard plan I want to test out in a certain matchup. So it's sort of a 3-phase process where you do the homework, then you have your sort of level 1 questions that you answer through your own private testing, and then you fill in the gaps that your private testing wasn't able to fill with really focused testing at the end.
I really like that. And I think that's a really great way for someone to get into it and start going. And one of the things I really like about it is I always tell people, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, Ross, is, what do you think is the more effective? Your 101st game playing, Abzan aggro and standard, or spending 30 minutes and like reading over the deck list and thinking about like, okay, this is like, the last couple week of standard results. How would they sideboard against me? What are they doing? And looking over sort of all those lists and taking them in to think about it. Stuff like that and what you talked about, I think, are much better ways to go about practicing, and are something you really hit on is there's like, okay, there are key interaction points, right? Am I weak to Ragavan in Modern is a great one, right? That's a bar every single deck has to pass. If you can't survive a Ragavan hit, or you can't, outdo a Ragavan in some way, then your deck is going to have a real issue, and it needs some way to solve it. Maybe it's post board or whatever. Maybe it's some weird plan, but you have to have something for it. And there are lots of different ways to go about trying to figure that out. But it doesn't always have to be playing, right? You can think about some of these things beforehand and try and start theory crafting a little bit.
I completely agree, and I do a lot of theory crafting in my preparation. And it's a skill that I have built up over many years. It's something I think I'm pretty good at, because I've always operated a lot better when I understand the big picture. So I have to have an understanding of the decks I'm facing and the overall texture of the metagame and my own deck strategy and how I can adjust that strategy from matchup to matchup. And once I have an understanding of the options before me and the problems that I'm facing, then to me, figuring out what the optimal route to go is generally pretty easy, or at least figuring out a hypothesis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Once I see the deck that's a problem, whatever matchup it may be, I say, it's a problem for X, Y, and Z. We can solve that problem with A, B, and C in the sideboard, and then you test the A, B, C sideboard plan, and it's like middle school, scientific method. And devise a hypothesis, build an experiment, which is effectively, designing your testing in a certain way, which is another thing I think people don't do enough of, where, if you're trying to test out a certain sideboard plan, why don't you just test games where you always draw your sideboard cards?
Oh my God, yes. I tell people, the first thing I tell people in coaching, Ross, if they have the local play group, is y'all are not cheating enough. Put the cards in your hand. No one needs to actually draw. You can just make sure to actually be effective with your time. Sorry. It's something that, I feel like everyone talks about, and it's just you're allowed to do it. It's okay. Just, don't cheat in actual tournaments.
Yeah. I have been on multiple Pro Tour testing teams where everybody just wants to test on MTGO because that's what they're used to. And I tell them, why aren't we all just testing on Magic Workstation? I don't even know if that still exists. Mm-hmm. It was effectively a program that acted like a virtual card table, and you loaded all of the sets, so you could just build every deck, and you controlled everything. There was no rules engine to it, so you could look at your deck and put a card into your hand if you wanted to start with that card in your hand, and do everything that you could do in paper testing, but it would shuffle for you. And so you got to do it, you got all the advantages and flexibility of paper testing with none of the, cumbersome nature of handling physical cards. And every time I suggested it, everybody looked at me like I had six heads. Like, Magic Workstation, why would we ever do that? Mm-hmm. And the 2 or 3 people that I managed to convince to do it with me were convinced immediately that it was the best way to do it. I'm very smart, and if everybody listened to me, the world would be a better place. Wow. That's my point.
The other point I'm picking up is I didn't realize how similar we were about this process, because we're sort of in different, I kind of came in as things were sort of going out, and then we've just been in different ponds as it
Great minds think alike, Mason.
That's so true. Goats just get in a hurry is what I hear. So it just makes sense that we found each other. No, but speaking of finding something, one of the things that you and I actually talked about after the Apex event we just both got back from this past weekend was deck selection yesterday, and kind of sparked this, sort of impromptu guesting episode. And I would really love to talk to you about sort of the process in which you go about selecting decks, and maybe some of the, fallacies or things that you think about when people come to conclusion about decks. And this might be a bit more of a conversation than an interview portion part of it, but I think it'd be really helpful for listeners because it's something that I've been thinking about a lot. And to be fair, we did actually just do an episode about 2 months ago, Ross, with the ideas that I have is called being a reasonable deck gamer. And what I told everyone on the show, and it is a true story, is when I first started grinding in 2019 and I was setting up to grind in 2020 and I wanted to get buys, I always picked a deck that was reasonable. And I think I even maybe mentioned you in the example, but the idea is if I walk up and Edgar Magalhaes and Ross Merriam are there and I say, I'm playing this deck, they don't laugh or they don't think twice, I have a good stock deck at minimum, right? And that was my bar. I might not play the best deck, but no matter what, I'm going to have a good deck with good sideboard plans. And if you do scoff, I'm going to be able to defend myself, right? And that was sort of this idea that we sort of sparked, but there's definitely way more to it than that. And we kind of hinted at touching on that. And this is sort of, part of that series, I think. So I'd love to have that conversation with you and sort of where your head goes to when you hear those things.
I have a very similar opinion to the one you just espoused. The way I think about it is I think the idea of a deck being well positioned, which is what that's sort of everyone's goal when they're picking a deck. They want a deck that is well positioned for the metagame, right? Mm-hmm. And that idea is incomplete. And it's incomplete because what it means in a literal sense is that this deck is better than it otherwise would be because of the specific circumstances of the current metagame. So when you say a deck is well positioned, what you're talking about is the delta between its current goodness, however you would measure that, and its average goodness across an infinite range of metagames, right? You're talking about that delta. But if that deck is starting from a very low base, that average range, then the delta needs to be huge in order for it to recoup its natural disadvantage. Mm-hmm. Whereas a deck that is naturally very powerful doesn't need to be that well positioned in order to actually be good. So what you're actually trying to select is the best deck, but the best deck is a combination of your baseline power level and your baseline goodness, as well as your the however you would measure your well positionedness. It's the sum of those two things. So you have to take into account both variables. So when you say, I'm always going to play a deck that is, at least reasonable, to me, what you're saying is I'm always going to play a deck that has a certain baseline goodness, however you might measure that. And I agree. I tried to do the same thing. I can think a deck that, is well positioned, but it's just so underpowered that I'm not willing to play it. I'm going to look for a deck that might be slightly less well positioned, but is significantly more powerful. Because in any big, tournament you play, you run into a lot of variance. You can metagame as much as you want. You're going to play Joe Schmo, with their deck from 3 months ago in round 3. And if you can't beat that guy, then you have no business being at the tournament.
No, I actually really love that. And I think it's possible, once again, shout out to Apex this past weekend. We saw a Bant version of the Lotus Field deck that had the Beanstalk added. And I think the Up the Beanstalk was a big get for that deck and maybe solve some of these problems. But a huge problem I had with the Lotus Field control deck before recently, and maybe still do, we'll have to see how tested goes, but it was that the deck was very cumbersome and clunky and really relied on sort of getting a Lotus Field early and had, its average mana value in the deck was 5. And you're a control deck and you're really counting on these sweepers to do a lot of work. And if your opponent, was playing a proactive deck, you could sometimes just get run over if your draw didn't come together. Also, you just didn't really come out, work out very well. And for control decks, there's some amount of obviously spells lining up, but a lot of times they can sort of just keep cards that interact, and then, really good ones at least can sort of turn the corner and win the game, right? And people would say, well, I'm playing Lotus Field Control because it's so good against Rakdos Sacrifice. It's so good against Mono Green. And those two decks are kind of the peak of power right now in Pioneer, right? Maybe a little bit of debate there, but Mono Green for sure, if it's on the play, I don't care how good you think your matchup is, Elf into Kiora into another Elf is probably going to beat you if there's any follow-up, right? And that sort of fail rate is underappreciated by players.
Oh, it definitely is. And, players get very simplistic in their justification when they say things like, I'm playing this because it has a good matchup against the supposed best deck or most popular deck in the room. And no matter how good that matchup is, that deck is only 20% of the field. You're effectively making a decision based on 1/5 of what's going on. And, if your matchups against the rest of the field aren't good, that's a problem. So people make a lot of incomplete arguments in order to justify the decision that they want to make. And it's usually justifying them playing the deck that they like or the deck that they have cards for or could borrow cards for. And, card availability aside, because that is a legitimate reason to, not play certain decks. I think Magic players would be, most Magic players would be very helped by just sort of learning baseline rhetoric and understanding what a complete argument is. I mentioned earlier that my degree is in math, and I was a low-level PTQ grinder in my teens, and I queued for a Pro Tour within 6 months of graduating college. And I could tell that I was analyzing things at a higher level than I was before, despite having played a lot of Magic when I was in college. And I really think it was just the skills that I had built in terms of problem solving and argument building, sort of proof writing, that helped me understand things and, maybe see holes in my thinking that were there that I couldn't see before and level up as a result. So I always tell people that I got significantly better at Magic over those 4 years, despite not playing a whole lot. And if other players built those skills too, they get a lot better as well.
Yeah, I have to agree. I think there's a lot that goes on in deck selection, and I think sort of I don't know. To me, the answer is the idea of thinking about and metagaming and coming up with a solution is often a lot of the fun, right? Like it's like, oh, how am I going to solve this problem, right? Mason keeps playing mono green, like how am I going to beat that deck? Okay, I'm going to play this black red creativity deck, or whatever, right? And so figuring out those puzzles is really cool, and that's like a fun thing to do. But so often, players don't do all the work, right? And it's like, okay, well, you've beat mono green, it's 10% of the room or whatever, because we live in the real world, in open tournaments where not everyone's going to be incentivized to play the best deck, where they don't want to play the best deck, where they think it's miserable like mono green, so they just don't play it, I've seen plenty of strong players just not play green because they think it's miserable, And that's just a reality of the world we live in.
I actively look to avoid playing green because I really don't want to play mirrors.
So you're scared of mirrors?
I'm not scared. I think I'd be fine at them. I would just be miserable.
Sure. Interesting.
And I'm at a point in my career where I can sacrifice some equity for my own happiness.
Yeah, and I do think understanding where you're at with things too is where your goals are is important. Like what Ross just said there, right? Like Ross has played a bunch. He's very skilled. He can also make up some points, but also maybe Ross is just like, yeah, I'm playing this RCQ because it's around the corner from my house, and yes, maybe green is the best deck to play, but I'd rather, play spirits and be happy, And I learned this lesson a long time ago. Do you remember during KCI summer when Sam Pardee, Matt Nass, and Beckstrom just couldn't lose a GP, and they just top-aided all of them playing KCI?
Yes, yeah, I was just affirming.
Oh, yeah, it was a crazy time, right? And in that period, one of the GPs that got top 8 near the end, Sam Pardee's playing spirits, and he ends up top 8ing, and they interview him, and they go, Sam, y'all have mastered KCI, you have different tech every week, you figured it out, what made you switch to spirits? Was it a metagame thing? Did you think you finally, the whole world's on KCI, so it's time to switch? And Sam just kind of shrugs and goes, yeah, spirits is a lot of fun, I kind of got bored playing KCI. It's a real answer, He was a platinum pro, the highest thing you could be at the time.
Yeah, so all the advice that I give to people is under the guise that they're just trying to maximize their equity in a tournament. But if you want to make decisions for your own personal well-being, do it. Just understand that you're sacrificing some equity to do so. And if you're okay with that, fine.
Yeah, it's totally cool to be like, I want to win, but I want to win on my terms, where I want to do the best I can, but I refuse to play green, and I lose 5% equity, so I lose 5% equity. I just use green because Abe and I here on the show and Spencer too, we all just bang the green drum like crazy, and we're doing everything we can because, conspiracy theory, if we get enough people to play at Ross, then maybe something will happen. You know what I mean? So we've got to be doing our part. It's a collective group effort thing. Maybe we could talk more about that later. But regardless, that is something that you can do and be okay with, right? And that's fine. But, we are sort of, as always on the show, don't forget, we are assuming if you're listening to Constructive Criticism that your goal is to maximize winning. And it is cool to have different goals, and it is okay to have other goals. And if it sounds like we're not saying it that way, one, never our intent. And two, that's just because we're sort of targeting a certain thing. And that's cool if your goals differ. And also, this is the coolest thing, Ross. They can differ for a weekend, right? I can just be like, hey, I'm going up to Apex this weekend. I'm going to drink with my buddy Ross, and I'm playing Lutri Control. And I'm getting that round 1 feature, and I'm going to make his job on commentary hard. And that can be that's a fine goal.
Yeah. Oh, especially when you're grinding tournaments week in, week out, you do sometimes need a palate cleanser. I was that person earlier in my career where I just picked a deck and I played it for months and months on end. But back in the day when the SCG Tour was standard on Saturday, Legacy on Sunday, I played Blue White Delver and Green White Maverick for, I want to say, about 6 straight months, from March to September. 2 to 3 weekends a month. I would change 2 to 3 cards in both decks every week. And I would, and that was it. I just played the exact same decks every time. Now I mix it up a little bit more, except when I find a deck that's really sweet, like Jeskai Breach in Modern. But I've danced around a lot more in Pioneer, and sometimes you just need to play something fun.
Well, now we sort of got our casual Timmy part out of the way. Jokes aside, I want to go back really quickly about deck selection, and specifically a little bit maybe about standard too, because that is something that's coming up, right? Like standard has
Yeah.
not been a focal point of Magic for about 3 years now, but we're at the start of the modern season. We both love modern. It's my favorite format. But standard is coming, and some things like this might be helpful because a lot of people just haven't ever competed in standard, and standard's a spot where deck selection and knowing how to go about these things matter so much. So what are some of the ways you go about that, Ross, and that are maybe a little bit different and you can actually do things in standard?
Yeah. So in my deck selection process, regardless of the format, step one is to establish that baseline goodness or baseline power level. And so, I effectively put decks into one of two categories. Is it good enough to be in consideration, or is it not? And it's a subjective, rating. There are, decks that people win tournaments with that I would never play in a million years, and there are, decks that aren't very popular that I would gladly play. So that's sort of a skill and an intuition that you have to build yourself over years of trial and error. But step one is, what are the decks that I'm even going to consider, and I come up with that bank of decks, and that's usually just generally the best decks in the format, 5 or 10 of them. But I also go through the various fringe decks, because I find frequently that there are fringe decks that just haven't been tuned well and are missing a little something. And if I look at a deck and I think it has some potential, I might put in some work on it. This is where I think it's important to just generally play a lot with a lot of different decks. It's one of the things that Versus Live helped me with. It just exposed me to a lot of different decks. It's actually where I first saw Jeskai Breach. Corey played it against me on a Versus Live video, and I had never seen it before, and it looked really good. It's like, I think this deck's actually kind of busted. And months later, I was playing it myself. So having some exposure to a lot of different decks can help you figure out which ones you think are above that line and which ones you think are below that line. But once you establish that above the line group, then you can start going ahead and thinking which of these decks is actually well positioned, so better than its baseline goodness in the current metagame, which are worse than that based on the current meta conditions, and that will further narrow down my list. And that's sort of the rough process that I'll go through. And by the end of that, I'll usually have it narrowed down to 2, 3, or 4 decks.
Yeah. And then one of the kind of cool things about standard that I know you can definitely speak to is once you kind of have a metagame, it's a lot different than other formats, right? Like in Pioneer and Modern, one, it's very expensive. Like just for let's use Modern as an example, right? If Dross, you want to change decks or whatever, and you don't have a vast collection or don't have friends that can borrow cards, we're talking minimum $500-$600 to change decks, right? And in standard, that's not really the case, right? It's $500 or $600 quite often to have 2 to 3 of the top decks, and the top decks sort of happen, and the removal in the metagame is actually like the pool of cards is so much smaller than in modern that players can't always answer everything all the time, right? So, for example, currently in modern, if you try to play a creature, Solitude, Fury, Leyline Binding, and Holy Heat, those 4 cards are going to put so much pressure on your creatures. There's only certain ones that can get played, right? But in standard, your removal spells are a lot different. So you might have something like Ultimate Price be the best removal spell in standard, right? Destroy target monocolored creature. And if every deck's playing Ultimate Price, you might be like, listen, this deck has a lot of gold creatures. It seems really well positioned against what else the other parts of the deck is doing. I maybe want to play this on this week, and it sort of goes back to how we started all this, right? That deck maybe has a slightly lower base power than maybe this Ultimate Price deck we talked about, but the delta and everything's made up because of all the other factors, right? And people can actually play those decks, and metagames are much smaller, right? If it's a 5-deck metagame, and let's say one deck is 30% of the field or whatever, it actually happens, like there might be smaller percentages, etc., because there are just less cards to be played, right? Compared to Modern Pioneer, where, if someone told me they won a Modern RCQ with like any deck off the first, 20 decks on Goldfish, I probably wouldn't bat an eye at any of them. It'd be like, that's dope. What was their sideboard like? In standard, if you told me we get past like maybe the second line of decks or whatever, I'm getting really surprised, right? And that's sort of a completely different thing in those kind of smaller pool formats.
Yeah, it definitely tends to narrow because it's a lower baseline power level format, and that can create some decks that are really just at the top. But if you don't have those decks, if it's a more balanced standard format, Then you get to a situation where the baseline power of different decks is relatively flat and there's not much edge to be gained there. So you're going to gain a much higher percentage of your overall edge from deck selection via picking a deck that is well positioned. It's that delta that ends up mattering more. So there's a lot of standard environments where switching decks week to week ends up being quite beneficial. And one of the tricky parts of standard is figuring out if this is a time to switch decks or if it's a time to lock in on one deck and play it week in and week out.
And that's part of the fun, and why a lot of players have a lot of love for standard, including our one of our hosts, Spencer. I think is really good at sort of like, okay, this week it's like kind of that flat power level we're talking about. I think X is the best thing for these reasons. Switches to it, and then it's off it by the next week or whatever. Right? Just had a moment in its sun. I'm playing it. Maybe he loves it, plays a little bit longer, but for the most part, just like does its thing, gets out. And that is like a big part of it. So. That's something to kind of look forward to, if you're newer. I know there's a lot of people who sort of got in during the COVID boom of Arena, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that on the show. But Ross, before we start wrapping up here, do you have any other thoughts or things that you want to talk about deck selection? I kind of, led the charge here, but I'd love to let you, have a moment to say anything about that, or just improving in Magic in general.
Yeah, so there's one last thing about deck selection, and one last element of my process, and it harkens back to what I said about understanding your own strengths and weaknesses and playing to them. And so my, sort of internal metric for how good decks are is always going to be biased by how well I think they fit my strengths and weaknesses. So personally, I generally avoid, uh, the most controlling decks in a format. I like decks that are very proactive. I like decks that can punish people when they stumble because regardless of the matchup, people can stumble. They can mulligan to 5. They can miss a land drop, and I always want to play decks that consistently punish those missteps from my opponents. And I highly value flexibility. So I really try to avoid linear decks unless I think it's an incredibly good weekend for them where nobody's targeting them at all. And I like, in particular, strategic flexibility. So a deck that can win in a variety of different ways. It's one of the things that attracted me to the Jeskai Breach deck in Modern. That's a deck that can play an aggro game, it can play an attrition game, and it can also play the combo game. And I think one of my strengths as a Magic player is being able to, roll with the texture of an individual game and say, I have a plan in this matchup, but the way this specific game is playing out, I have to deviate from the plan in X way. I have to, go hard for the combo or go completely away from the combo, whatever the case may be. So I value decks that are able to give me those decisions to make because I think I'm good at making those decisions.
Makes a lot of sense to me. Well, Ross, thank you so much for taking some time to come on the show and talk about this, especially last minute. It was a huge help to us, and it was great to have you, and I hope the listeners enjoyed this episode with you.
Yeah, I hope they did too. I had a blast being here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Ross, if someone wants to find you and sort of maybe get more content or something from you, where can they go? What can we be linking in the bio?
So best place for everything I'm doing in Magic is just my Twitter account at Ross Hunnids. You can also find my podcast with Tan and Grace, MTG Rants, wherever podcasts are found. We also have a Patreon for that if you want to support our work. It's just MTG Rants. So you can find that on Patreon. But main thing is to follow on Twitter because I've got some things coming along the pipeline, Mason, that people are going to want to hear about.
Yeah, the pipeline's exciting, and they can find you once again on the Apex coverage, right? You just got back, we both just got back, as we mentioned earlier, and there's more of those events coming up. So that's another place where if you're interested in paper Magic, you want to check that out, and you can hear Ross talk about the games.
Yeah, twitch.tv/Apex Gaming. We've got another event coming up in October. I believe it's the last weekend of October, the 28th, 29th, something like that. We're going to actually bring through Apex, we're going to have some Lorcana events coming up in October as well. I think I'm going to be tapped in to do some commentary for that. So if you're getting into the Lorcana, you can find me there at Apex. And I also do commentary for Mana Traders with Corey Baumeister. We are commentating the next Mana Traders event at the end of this month, the last weekend of September, and that is going to be a vintage event. So if you want to hear me commentate some vintage, you can watch me at their Twitch channel, which is just Mana Traders, I believe.
Yeah, our last guest, I think I think Dom came on before Jerry, but Dom, if you love Dom, he's probably going to be crushing Vintage. He's just been crushing it basically every weekend until he queued for Worlds, because now he's just, all in on doing the best at Worlds. But I'm sure once he's done with that, he'll just go back to, changing four cards in every Vintage deck and just crushing the format. So you're going to tune in for that. It's going to be a fun time.
Yeah, he plays Underworld Breach, so we're rooting for him too.
Yeah, he has 2 Yogg Wills in his deck. It's crazy. Anyways, Ross, thank you so much. And we will see you all next week for another episode of CCMTG.